Our topic for Section 10 of History 101 is the end of the medieval period. There is no one date or event that we point to as the end of the Middle Ages or the start of something more modern. Time period labels are always a bit vague. But what scholars see in the 14th, 15th, and early 16th century is a rough process of change. First, an era of disasters, breakdowns in the social and economic order that had held through the 12th and early 13th century. The disasters began for some Christian and Islamic societies with the Mongols. For those who escaped Mongol conquest, disaster came several decades later in the form of famine, disorder, and deadly disease. Yet during and after these disasters came a wave of recovery, social and political reordering, economic reconnection, and most famously a cultural movement called humanism or the Renaissance. Now, if you have studied the Renaissance before, my guess is you have heard or read it was a dramatic creation of 15th century Italy. As we shall see, though, the 15th century in Italy is not the whole story. Our goal here is to put the Italian Renaissance in wider context, to note its links to Byzantine and Islamic society, and to think about what trends, if any, marked a serious cultural change here. In this first podcast, we focus on the disasters of the later medieval period. And let's start with a quick recap. For many societies in Europe and the Middle East, disasters started already in the 13th century with the arrival of the Mongols. Last section, we followed the conquests of Chinggis Khan, his nomad armies, and their successors. Between 1210 and 1280, their loose band of horsemen warriors had conquered nearly everything from the Pacific coast of China to the Euphrates River and the Black Sea region. We spoke about the impact of conquest and Mongol misrule in the mid to late 13th century in Iran, Iraq, and in Russia. We noted the huge losses of life, the end of the old political power centers in Russian Kiev and Abbasid Baghdad. Yet not every Western society saw the Mongols as a disaster. Egypt and North Africa were spared conquest, so was Byzantium and nearly all of Latin Christendom. These regions even profited because they became by default more important, and because they gained from new trade ties all the way to Eastern Asia through the Mongol realm. For Christian Russia, the era of Mongol misrule lasted through the 14th and 15th centuries. For Islamic Iran and Iraq, though, the Mongols became less disastrous in the early 14th century as they converted to Islam, thanks to Islamic merchants and especially to the mystical Sufi movement. But the Mongols were not the only force for disaster. In fact, it was areas spared by the Mongols that proved ripest for a new wave of troubles in the 14th century, which lasted in some cases into the 15th. A root cause of many disasters, especially in Latin Christendom, was population growth. Recall that since the 10th century, the population in Europe had been steadily growing due to new farming techniques, new resources, and warmer climate. This process of growth continued until the early 14th century, when growth stalled. Why? With about 75 million people, Europe was finally overpopulated. It might sound strange to call 75 million in Europe overpopulation. After all, more than 500 million people live in Europe today. But feeding those people requires crops, farming methods, and technologies that were not available in the 14th century. By 1300, Europeans had cleared much of the good farmland. Any more cutting down of forest would mean a lack of heating fuel. They pushed to find land where possible, sometimes even reclaiming it from the sea. But they were near the limit of what their farmland could feed. Then the overpopulation problem was compounded by a new shift in the climate. In the 14th century, the climate of the whole region got a bit colder and much more unstable. The 14th century thus brought some warm years with reliable harvests, and several years of too much rain or too much cold, which led to severe famines. Overpopulation thus set off other problems. First, economic troubles. More people on the same land meant rising costs for basic food and clothing. With costs rising, peasants found themselves up short. More often they had to beg for forgiveness from some of their duties to lords or kings. But lords relied on those duties for their own livelihood. everyone got worried about coming up short. Thus, overpopulation led to more violent conflicts. Lords refused to let peasants flee to cities or new towns. So peasants started revolting against lords. Lords responded harshly. Kings demanded more troops and support from lords. Lords resisted. So kings turned to other sources of power, such as hiring mercenary armies, as we'll see. Lords responded hostilely. Several kingdoms suffered nasty civil wars and battles for the throne. Narrow resources made every conflict worse. Now, there were two classes that could find some profit in this general disorder: merchants and common soldiers. Some merchants were able to outcompete their peers and keep building bigger webs of trade. Venice and Genoa, in fact, were at the height of their wealth and power. Meanwhile, simple soldiers found lots of work. All the disorder and social breakdown meant more war and more reliance on short-term, common hired fighters, mercenaries. A skilled soldier for hire could go from war to war, collecting wages so long as he could survive. Disorders and struggles also affected the Latin Christian Church. In 1300, the Pope in Rome was at the peak of centralized power. Popes even entertained an old idea that they could unite Christendom behind them, that they were superior in power to every king. But violent disorder in central Italy threatened popes, and kings were always hostile to popes overstepping their role. In 1305, the French king invaded central Italy, rigged papal elections to choose a Frenchman as the new pope. The new pope was so unpopular in the city that he fled, along with all of his cardinals. They chose to live in Avignon, which was then a fort town on the French border owned by the church. So the Bishop of Rome found himself very far from Rome. Thus began a nasty conflict within the church system. Many Christian elites were hostile to the notion of popes living outside of Rome, so dependent on another worldly king. Popes lost prestige and vassals, and much of their land as local lords in Italy rebelled. Their troubles got worse in the 1370s when locals in Italy decided to name their own pope back in Rome. For 40 years, then, there were two competing popes, each declaring the other an anti-pope and a terrible heretic. From the 1370s on, Catholic Christian leaders were forced to choose which pope they supported and where to send some of their tithe money. Generally, church leaders struggled for every bit of tithe. As a result, the whole church structure lost support. Church leaders looked more like power-hungry warlords than holy men. Finally, in the 14th and 15th century, we see larger-scale political conflicts. In the early Middle Ages, most wars were small-scale and local. Not in the 14th century. Larger organized kingdoms got into grander long-term struggles over power and land. The worst of these new large-scale wars was probably the so-called 100 Years' War between the kings of England and France. Now, this name is inaccurate. The battles lasted, with some breaks, for more than 120 years. We might wonder how two kingdoms could fight continually this long. It has to do a lot with the failings of both medieval kingship and church order. The fighting began in 1337 over a marriage alliance gone wrong. The King of England married the daughter of the King of France, hoping to produce a son who would inherit both realms. But before that son could inherit, the King of France was overthrown by his other relatives. War began. At first, the fighting was fairly traditional and sporadic. Every few years, truces were struck. The kings relied still on elite lords and their armored knights. But the core question of who rightfully ruled France remained unsolved. Perhaps a pope could have helped, but remember, after 1370 there were two popes, one backing each side, blessing its war as holy. Then the battlefield violence got worse. England hired thousands of commoners, mostly longbow archers. And the result was a series of big English victories. Most dramatic was in 1415, when Henry V of England led his troops to slaughter tens of thousands of French knights at the Battle of Agincourt. The English king then took over most of northern France. But the English kings could not keep their conquests. They met local resistance, including from the famous Joan of Arc, who claimed guidance from God to defend the holy French cause. By the 1340s, most of these problems of disorder were thus underway and would play out for many years. But now we must add the deadliest disaster, the epidemic disease called the Black Death. The Black Death was a new strain of an old disease, bubonic plague. Plague is a species of bacteria, Yersinia pestis. It's endemic to some rodents of central China. In the 1330s, it began to spread to humans again in a new, deadlier form, one which could get into the lungs and kill more quickly. First, it spread inland in China, and then further west throughout the Mongol realm. Indeed, it was Mongol rule that sped the spread of the epidemic. In 1345, a Mongol army carried the plague to a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea. By 1347, merchant boats had passed the disease to Constantinople and then to Egypt and Italy, the densest population centers at the time. Black Death did affect the Islamic world deeply. The disease spread in Iran and Iraq, where it did further harm to the surviving peasantry. Nomads were better equipped to survive the disease, since it doesn't spread as well in more separated social conditions. So the disease helped to keep these areas for nomadic herders more than farmers. The disease hit even harder in Western Islam, especially in Egypt. About 1/3 of the population of Egypt was killed. Now, Egypt eventually recovered from this disease. Political powers held firm here and across North Africa. But the real surprise came a few years later in 1360 when the plague recurred. In fact, every 10 to 15 years or so, new outbreaks would come to one part or another of the Mediterranean world. While these were usually less severe than the first wave, the recurrences continued until the late 17th century. Now, Egypt had plenty of learned men and plenty of physicians. But no one in Egypt could really get at the workings of this disease. They knew it was passed from person to person. They did not know about bacteria or the way rodents passed the disease to fleas, who often passed it to persons. And so Egyptians were left grasping at straws to explain the mess. So, as we'll see, were Christian kingdoms. The impact of Black Death in Christendom was like the impact in Egypt, except on a wider scale. Starting from Genoa in 1347, the disease spread year by year along roads from farm to farm. By 1353, nearly every part of Europe had been affected. We have solid records for the number of people killed by the disease in some places. About half of the city of Genoa died in a few weeks. About half of Florence died the following year. More isolated rural areas did better at first, but even so, about 1/3 of more rural England met its end. By 1353, scholars think that about 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of Europe had died from the Black Death. The cities suffered the worst initial effects, and descriptions we have present a pretty nasty scene, near total breakdown of many social institutions. Eventually, cities recovered by enticing new immigrants to work in crafts. Rural areas suffered more long-term, with some places simply abandoned. So how did Western Christians respond to these disasters? We should recall the way Muslims responded to the arrival of the Mongols, and we see some similar patterns here. Some Christians and Muslims now looked for scapegoats to blame. For instance, when the plague broke out, Christian writers blamed a range of people for cursing or poisoning, heretics like the Cathars, most famously the Jews. The rumors of Jewish poisoners led to much violence against Jews at the time, and more Jews fleeing from parts of Western Christendom to the east. Then there were the theological explanations. Explanations that the disease was somehow a punishment from God, perhaps because leaders had sinned too much, or perhaps because Christians were, as a whole, leading more sinful lives. Some claimed that the plague marked the end of days, so people would need to purify themselves quickly before the Last Judgment. The 1350s, in fact, produced a truly odd religious movement called the Flagellants. These were ordinary townsfolk who took to whipping themselves in public, so their pain and blood would purify them. Church leaders mostly agreed to hunt down the Flagellants as heretics. One of the most interesting reactions shows up in artwork, a new fascination with blood and gore. Before Black Death, most Christian art had been very stylized, like icons. Afterward, we get displays of wounds and suffering in martyrdom stories and especially in crucifixion scenes. Indeed, society grew very interested in Jesus' physical suffering on the cross. They found it a source of solace, that Christ had gone through the kind of suffering that sometimes victims of plague and disaster went through. Yet perhaps the most interesting response to Black Death among Christians and Muslims was social commentary. We see writers looking at how societies responded to the disease. How did they hold together? How did people treat one another? Some writers were impressed. As we shall see, Ibn Battuta, a Muslim traveler, saw the plague strike Damascus. He was pleased with how Muslims of different sorts, and even Christians and Jews, united in the city to pray to God and work together to survive. He was less impressed with Egyptians' behavior or piety. Then there is Giovanni Boccaccio, a poet who saw the Black Death strike Florence. He was disturbed by the lack of shared support and even basic human morality in this his hometown. His description of social breakdown is striking. Now, Boccaccio has an added importance. He was a member of the first small circle of so-called humanists, which, as we'll see, over decades would become the Renaissance movement. As you read, you can think about how his interest in ancient Greek and Roman traditions and writings may have influenced his critical eye toward Florence in its worst disaster. I hope you have a sense now of the disasters that affected the Mediterranean world from the later 13th to the early 15th century. Please do not get me wrong. This was a long period. Not every day was hideous death and disease. Many harvests went fine. Many kingdoms stayed stable for long periods. All of the societies of the region survived these waves of problems. In fact, the survivors of a famine or plague might find a much easier life in the next few decades, with empty lands to farm, more demands for crafts, and more food and money available. More broadly, all the Mediterranean societies found ways to restore at least some order. In the late 14th and 15th century, some slices of the population actually profited like never before. Now, in Eastern Islamic lands, by the mid-14th century, the Mongol empires were now run by Muslims. And the same nomadic warriors that had harmed Islamic farmers and scholars now supported them. When the Mongol dynasty lost power in the 1340s, most regions fell under the rule of new nomadic warrior families, whose ancestry mixed Mongol, Turkish, and Persian. Sometimes a new nomad ruler would try to replicate the Mongol conquests. One such ruler, Timur, had the most success. But all of these rulers were now partnered with Islamic scholars and heeded Islamic rules on taxation. Their wars were more manageable, and they could be honored by scholars for helping to spread the Islamic faith. Meanwhile, Muslim Mongol rule proved a tremendous boon to the merchant class of the Islamic world. Iran and Iraq lost a lot of people, but it was a kind of golden age for some merchants traveling the region with long-distance wares, silk and porcelain from China, spices and cotton from India, and dozens of other commodities. Mongol rule facilitated long-distance trade over land on a scale not seen before. Recovery from disorder in Western Christendom was more complicated. Christians knew they needed more resources to endure sudden famines. They needed ways to settle the conflicts over resources and power and church leadership. On the economic front, Latin Christians gained by taking more advantage of the sea. In the 14th century, Western Christians found new ways to build sturdier boats, which could stand up to the waves and storms of the Atlantic and the North and Baltic Seas. Not only did this allow for more direct trade, it enabled fishing trips further and further out to sea. And the result was a new source of food, herring and cod mainly, which could be salted, preserved, and sent across the continent. Herring coming mostly from the Baltic, cod from the Atlantic. Wider sea-based trade proved important to the class of peoples that most thrived in the later 14th and 15th century, town-based merchants. Towns with craft industries recovered fastest by bringing in new workers from the countryside, and these towns became newly assertive in geopolitics. The Italian cities often tried to control new outposts and islands as colonies, as we'll see. In the north, cities instead formed cooperative leagues, which helped them to sustain order and peace. although ultimately the biggest economic boon in the region came when the climate shifted a bit more warm in the 15th century. Meanwhile, by the early 15th century, kings and church leaders found new ways to reestablish order. In most of Latin Christian world, kings started crafting more stable, organized governments, which did not depend as much on personal loyalty, but rather on regular taxes. Their stable sources of money allowed for larger paid armies and tighter control of their own lands. Now, at first, this centralization of royal power actually made for larger-scale violence, as in the 100 Years' War in England and France. But so long as that war was paused, and then after it ended, centralized kingdoms otherwise proved better at sustaining order. They also had an interesting effect of creating clearer political identities, marking people as French or English, in addition to being Christians from some village or town. We'll talk about this identity issue more as we go. Finally, Western Christians also tried to solve the long-festering problem of church conflict, the multiple popes struggling for authority. In the late 14th century, a new set of scholars arose in several Latin Christian universities, who carried an idea around that they called conciliarism. Conciliarism was essentially the notion that the ultimate leader of the church was not really the pope, but the whole church membership, which could be embodied in a council of representatives, bishops mainly. By the 1410s, there had been two competing popes for 40 years, but this group of scholars told both popes to step down. In 1415, a council was held in Constance, which is now on the German-Swiss border, which named a new pope to unite the whole Latin Church. After a couple of years, the two former popes agreed, reluctantly, to accept the new unified church leadership. Conciliarism, we should note, had another interesting side effect. The same logic that claimed the church was ultimately led by the will of a council could be applied to kingdoms. And some radical scholars went in that direction, claiming that kingdoms were not really the property of kings, but owned by the people, who somehow consented to be ruled by their monarch. This idea, in some sense rediscovered from ancient tradition, would have a long future, as we shall see.